Welcome, viewers and listeners, to the Total Football Analysis EPL podcast. We are the Thinking Fans podcast. Each week, we get together with our besties, who are current pro players, real coaches, academics, and smart technical analysts. We are going to LOL IMO. We want to liberate ourselves from the soccer Illuminati and democratize thoughtful football analysis. We hope that you finished the podcast with 3 or 4 cool soccer things that you didn't know before. Please join the revolution. Our team is as international as the English Premier League. We are American, Chinese, Italian, Indian, as well as our single English player. We are the world. We are the EPL podcast. My name is Chris Mumford, a professor of innovation at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm a former university goalkeeper and current cranky goalkeeper coach. For those of you who enjoyed Money Heist or La Casa de Papel, I'm known as the professor. Bella ciao, bella ciao. We are joined by Harshal Patel, a former JP Morgan financial analyst turned soccer analyst. He's forgotten more tactics and analytics than I will ever know. While he enjoys reading greatly, he's a remarkable dancer, particularly hip hop. We're trying to procure an appearance for him on the American show Soul Train. For these reasons, we call him the Dancer. David Seymour is a coach at the Claremont Football Academy in England and was a former coach at NCFC, the largest youth club in the U.S. He co-hosts the TFA Bundesliga podcast and writes for the magazine. For these reasons, we call him Coach. Daniele Pruch is a professional soccer player at North Carolina Football Club and journalist. He is a triple threat in that he's smart as a whip, has a hammer of a shot, and is very charming. He is the co-host of the TFA Serie A podcast. We call him 009, as that's the position he plays. So we have a professor, analyst, coach, and professional player. We are a veritable Ocean's 4, not Chet 11. I anticipate that we'll be violating the podcaster financial fair play regulations and may be sanctioned by UEFA, like Manchester City. We've received generous support from Total Football Analysis. They are the world's largest open source soccer analytics community. Please visit www.totalfootballanalysis.com and join and support the movement. Let's get restarted. Or more appropriately, let's talk about the restart of the EPL. So, here's what we know so far. On next Tuesday, all the clubs are going to get together and they're going to make a decision on if the season should restart. If that is successful on Thursday, they're going to determine how it's going to be done. David, what are your thoughts on some of the key issues with respect to the restart?
I think one of the big things that seems to be jumping out to me is the amount of players that seem to be speaking out on a bit of a low key level about not feeling comfortable at returning. And I think that there's a huge amount of pressure with both the Bundesliga, obviously, is well underway now, and La Liga has been given a start date of June 8, I think. So I think the Premier League is seeing pressure from its sort of European rivals as such. But I think player safety has to be first here. And if you've got players speaking out about it, I saw Danny Rose spoke out about it the other day. I'm sure I've seen a couple of others recently as well. Then I think that's an issue that certainly needs considering.
Very nice. Harshal, what's your take on the restart? What are the things that jump out at you?
I'd agree with David in that player safety and player health of the players needs to be paramount, because a lot of them have said, whoever has spoken out, some of them have spoken about them having vulnerable family members. Like, for example, Troy Deeney, who's captain at Watford, has said that he won't return to training because he has vulnerable family members at home. He has a kid and he's afraid of inadvertently, obviously, catching the virus and then potentially transmitting it to his kid. So that is obviously one of the biggest concerns around the restart. But another thing is the fact that a lot of clubs themselves are not comfortable, and it's been an evolving conversation where there were clubs which were not comfortable earlier who are okay with going ahead. And one of the biggest contentions or the biggest issues around that has been the fact that if the Premier League does return, it's likely to do so at neutral venues, where neither of the clubs will be at their own stadium. They may not even be in their own city. So, for example, Liverpool could play Aston Villa, for example, in London, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that has been spoken about by the clubs as, especially the ones that are towards the bottom and in a relegation fight, as being unfair in that if they have 3 or 4 home games left, that would cause a lot of disadvantage to them in terms of the impact that that sort of game being held at their own stadium as opposed to at a neutral venue could potentially have. So those clubs at the bottom have been some of the most vocal opponents of having the season go ahead at neutral venues. So, and there are still clubs which are opposing it. So I don't know.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting because I know a study just came out of 191 matches played without fans. And with fans, the win rate was 46%, pretty considerably. Without fans, the win rate for the home team was 36%, and the lose rate was 33%. So, I know 190 games is not a huge sample, but that seems to be still a pretty good leading indicator that maybe the no fan home advantage is actually de minimis. Daniela, you're a current professional pro player, and actually your league is trying to determine whether to go forward with the season. What's your take on kind of a player's perspective on COVID-19 and sequestering and all this sort of stuff?
You have players like me who are young in their first professional year or at the beginning of their career. And I feel like we would like to go back because we need to prove ourselves in this world, during this season. But at the same time, I can tell from the talks that are going on every day with my club here that other players, like Harshal said, other players are family, and they obviously think twice before going back. There is no doubt that everybody is excited at the thought of coming back, but we're gonna have to find some common ground and before actually making a comeback.
Okay, well, good. Well, I do think that it's certainly a very complicated moral issue, and we all want things to be safe. The question is how do we define safe, right? And what is a level of acceptable risk? And I imagine we're keeping our fingers crossed that on Tuesday, all the different parties come to an amicable solution. So then on Thursday, we can decide to move forward. The logistics are going to be challenging. It seems like there's a lot of pushback on whether to play in their home venues or not. So I'm going to be fascinated with that. And just the sheer travel. I know that some of the leagues in the U.S. have great trepidation because of the large distances, but even traveling within England, there's still points of potential exposure. So it's going to be fascinating to see how this unfolds. But I say that we are the EPL podcast, so we are quite excited about the EPL starting. It's probably a great understatement.
Chris, was that study that you referred to? Surely they could have just looked at any regular Man City home game to see what it's like to play without fans.
You're absolutely right about that. So, so let's move to the next topic, which is injury updates. Clearly, this break has been a disadvantage for some teams that have been on a real roll, and perhaps a significant advantage to those teams that were suffering injuries of significant contributing players. The first team that comes to mind is Tottenham. Harry Kane had a really debilitating hamstring injury, and they pretty much thought he was done until the summer. But he's had some time back and is actually training. No official word yet, but that could be a real difference maker for Tottenham to make a late push into Champions League form. Harshel, can you talk about Man U? That they seem to be another potential beneficiary of the time off.
Oh, absolutely. United lost Marcus Rashford to a double stress fracture in his back when he was played in an FA Cup game against Wolves. And Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, was actually criticized at that time by a lot of United fans and some of the media in general as well, because he had said that Rashford was actually playing with a bit of a knock, and he still decided to bring him on, and then he ended up suffering a sort of a double stress fracture, which potentially ruled him out for the rest of the season. And Rashford has been in probably the best form of his career this season. He's scored, I think, 15 or 16 goals in the league. He's got a bunch of assists, and he was really the catalyst for United going forward. But it seems as if we do come back in the next couple of weeks or so, that if not straight at the beginning, Marcus Rashford will probably play some part in this season, which may not have been the case, which probably wouldn't have been the case, to be honest, if the season had been interrupted. And so that's one. And then the other big sort of update, or the other big player we'll have coming back, is Paul Pogba. I mean, he's had a bit of a mystery injury in the sense that he's had some sort of foot injury since September, and he's not played at all since then. I think other than maybe a couple of substitute appearances here and there, but he's basically not been a part of the squad this year. And obviously there is always going to be rumors around him leaving. But just in terms of, even if he is fit enough to come back and play in these last 8 or 9 games that Manchester United have left, and the potential for him being able to combine with Bruno Fernandes, who has hit the ground running since he joined the club in January. So Rashford and Pogba alone could just propel United into the top 4 and make them get into the Champions League, which may not have been possible had we not stopped the season earlier. So as you said, this break has proven to be a bit of a blessing in disguise for United in that sense.
So, Coach, let's look at the other end of the table, Bournemouth and Aston Villa, in terms of how injuries have impacted their season and how that any sort of potential returns could impact whether they make the cut this year or not.
Yeah, Bournemouth is particularly interesting. I think they've had some real bad luck, possibly more so than almost anyone else in the league, in my opinion. I think losing David Brooks was a huge loss. He's missed, I think he missed the whole season, and we'll talk about a little bit later on. But you see Callum Wilson get isolated constantly, playing as a lone striker, and David Brooks is the kind of player that can really link the midfield well with the forward. It's a position that they've lacked. Other than that, I mean, you've got Lloyd Kelly, who they signed for 13 million last summer. He's a left back from Bristol City. He's been out for. Has he been out for the whole season, Harshal? I think he has, right?
I think so. I don't think he's played. Yeah, most of the season. He's not really played a lot this year.
Charlie Daniels, who is another left back. So that's 2 left backs they've been without. He's been injured for most of the season. Jack Stacey was a January signing.
I think it was a summer signing.
Summer signing, and he's missed several games as well. They've been very unfortunate. I think Artur Buric is injured as well, but he's less important. And then with Villa, I mean, obviously they invested 22.5 million in Wesley in the summer, and he didn't really hit the ground running. I think he scored 5 goals so far for Villa, but I mean, he's still an important part to how they play, particularly as Villa leak goals. So they sort of have a bit of a, we'll try and score as many as you, which hasn't really worked. So that's a big loss for them. And I think he's going to be back in training beginning of June, but I wouldn't expect him to feature before the end of the season. And of course, they brought in Pepe Reina as well, and they've got Jed Steer and Tom Heaton injured. So they've been a bit unfortunate as well with injuries.
So Daniele, give us your thoughts on how one comes back from these injuries and, this time off. And, really number one is injury recovery. And then number two is you guys started your season, you had your first match, and then all of a sudden you ended up sitting for some weeks. Explain to us how both of those dynamics work.
So for sure, when you come back from an injury, you are going to try to rush things because you look forward to coming back on the pitch. And the process, during the process, resting is fundamental, but it is frustrating as well because you are gonna spend a lot of time with in the training room with your physical therapist. You're gonna take small steps every day. It's gonna look like this is gonna go very slow. It's gonna be repetitive, and but the most important part is sticking with the doctors, with the physical therapists, listening to what they have to say, and come back only when you're 100%. When you come back, there's gonna be some movements that you're gonna be afraid of making, because maybe that's exactly a movement that got you injured in the first place. So you may be adjusting your movements in that sense until you get 1, 2, 3 weeks into training, and then you're gonna be able to clear up your mind and be yourself 100%. In terms of the break, it's tough. Like you said, we played one game and then we got suspended. Our season got postponed. We don't know yet if we're gonna come back. So right now we're training, not knowing when there will be a season and if there will be one. So the motivation right now is harder to collect, but it's good to go through this with your teammates / roommates. So whenever the season will come back, we'll be ready.
Good. Well, so why don't we go ahead and switch gears a little bit and talk about the next topic, which is we're going to focus on relegation, who the potential candidates are for that. We've got Brighton at 29, West Ham, Watford, Bournemouth tied at 27. Aston Villa's at 25, but they do have an additional game to play. And then, unfortunately, Norwich is at lowly 21. So some interesting dynamics here. I think it's really going to come down to the wire. David, can you walk us through some of the how you're looking at the relegation?
Yeah, I'll quickly run through some sort of basic stuff that I looked at, and I think first of all, when you look at these situations, it's important to look at expected points as well to see which teams really deserve to be down there and which don't. So this bar graph here, if you're listening and not watching, we've got a bar graph here which shows both the points and expected points of every team in the bottom half of the expected points table. So, I mean, if we were looking at, I put it in order. We've got Aston Villa, Bournemouth, Newcastle, Norwich, West Ham, Crystal Palace. Then, interestingly, Arsenal, Spurs, Brighton, and Watford. That's an ascending order. Yeah, there was some interesting things to look at here. I think both Villa and Bournemouth, it looks like they deserve to be where they are. Whereas Newcastle, who are in fact in 13th place, have clearly been quite lucky with their games. So I wanted to look at why that might have been. Whereas Norwich, on the flip side, have been unlucky. And Norwich actually should have 10 points more than they do, according to the expected points total. So, yeah, that was interesting. It's particularly interesting to see as well, Watford were above both Arsenal and Spurs, as were Brighton. And have clearly been unlucky, but nevertheless, Watford are in 17th, Brighton are in 15th, and very much in this relegation fight.
So you're saying that Norwich could theoretically be at 31 points and well above the fray based upon this? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, look, with anything like this, it's all theoretical and doesn't normally work out like this. But I would go back to, for example, I read this in Football Hackers, which is a book by Christopher Biermann, who is a German writer, and he used a brilliant example to discuss expected goals, which links very heavily with expected points, of Newcastle when Alan Pardew was in charge, and they had a brilliant season where they finished in the top half. I want to say they finished 5th.
Yes.
They did. Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
So, and then Papiss Cissé had a breakout season. He scored 3 or 4 ridiculously good goals. But their expected goals was actually very low. And the following season, they were around sort of 15th, 16th, and I believe Pardew was sacked. But actually, if you go back and look at the data, really, they were just incredibly lucky in that first season where they finished 5th. And the second season where Pardew was sacked, or however many seasons he's been in charge, but that season where he was sacked, that was where they really should have been according to form both seasons. So it's quite a useful tool to predict at least long-term form.
Right. Well, if we believe Elon Musk and we live in a world of mini simulations, Norwich could be middle table or even contesting for Europa in a simulation. So, well, we wish them the best of luck. As we move to the next slide here, we've got conceded and expected goals against. Help walk us through this, Coach.
Yeah, I mean, so again, we've got the teams in order this time of expected goals against, and then we've got two constant lines going across, with the yellow representing expected goals against, and that's the same as expected goals, obviously, for the league. And the purple line is going for actually the average amount of conceded goals for the league, not just for these teams, for the whole league. So the average expected goals or expected goals against for the league is 41.53. And expected conceded, and the actual conceded goals for the league is 39.2. And there's some interesting sort of, for example, Villa have got a far higher expected goals against than they actually have. It's around, I think, 63 is their expected goals against, and they've still got the leakiest defence in the league with 56. So they're actually outperforming their expected goals against, and they're still terrible at the back. So that's not good news for Villa. Norwich have outperformed their expected goals against, but again, they are a team that have struggled defensively. If we look sort of further up the table, and it's interesting to see Crystal Palace, for example, might suggest why they are further up in the table and not lower down, because of their defence vastly outperforming their expected goals against. Low 30s for the actual amount of goals they've conceded. I want to say 32. Is that right, Harshal?
Yeah.
Yeah, and their expected goals against is over the Premier League average. So some interesting things to look at there. West Ham, unfortunately for me, have conceded the exact amount they should have done, which is telling when you think about how shocking Roberto was in goal. I'm sure you had many moments, Chris, where you were wondering what on earth he was doing. But a lot of those goals that he conceded would have had a very low expected goal value. So perhaps actually West Ham's defence has been slightly better than the expected goals would suggest because of those goals. I mean, I think at the time I went back and there were 6 or 7 goals that Roberto conceded where you really would have expected him to have done better. Yeah. Very
good. All right, next slide here.
Yeah, I mean, this is just something that really popped up when we're looking at Newcastle. Something that we spoke about earlier off air was how Steve Bruce has actually been relatively sort of well regarded for the job he's done at Newcastle this season, and many are suggesting he should keep the job if the takeover happens. And yeah, there's some interesting stats, certainly with regards to their expected goals against. But I just wanted to bring this up because the league average for passes per defensive action, which is 11.67. Passes per defensive action, if you don't know, is it occurs in the final 60% of the pitch is where it's measured. And it's where a opponent's pass starts, and you count the amount of passes in a game by an opponent in that 60%, and then you divide it by the defensive actions. So things like one tackles, slide tackles, interceptions, those sort of things. So that's how you work out your PPDA. And interestingly for Newcastle, theirs is the highest by some distance. It's just, I think it's just below 18, but the graph makes it look like it's 18, but I could be wrong there. Way below anyone else's in terms of intensity. So we're not seeing an intense press from Newcastle. They're clearly the sort of team that sits back and tries to make teams break them down. But actually, that Newcastle PPDA is the lowest in any of the European top leagues.
Interesting.
Top 5.
Good. So, Harshal, help us unpack this here. What are your prognostications on who's going to get relegated?
So if you look at the table right now, obviously Villa have a game in hand. And there are 3 teams who are on 27 points. So West Ham, Watford, Bournemouth are all level on 27 points from 29 games. They all have 9 games to play. Villa are 2 points behind them with a game in hand. So they have 10 games to play. But that game in hand is against Arsenal, I believe. I may be getting that wrong. But the point is they have a game in hand. So I think Norwich, sadly enough, I think are done. They have 6 points to make up. I mean, we have seen teams come back and sort of push and have amazing comebacks and survive. I mean, Leicester are the biggest example in terms of recent examples where we saw them come back from the dead in the season prior to the season when they won the Premier League. So in the 2014-15 season uh, under who was the manager? Neil Warnock. No,
Who told
why
me
am I?
that? Do you mean
Leicester. Nigel Pearson. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So Nigel Pearson was the manager back then. He got them back from the dead. That was the biggest example in recent times. Roy Hodgson has done a similar job with Crystal Palace in recent times, but I don't see Norwich being able to survive. Of the rest of the teams, as much as this may hurt you, David, I actually think West Ham are a bit vulnerable because Watford have done well since the change in management, relatively well. They've had a bad bit of form recently, like before obviously the season was suspended. But I think West Ham might just get sucked into the bottom three towards the end, and probably Villa. I think Villa are just too open at the back. They've not been able to solve their defensive issues, even though they have one of the best playmakers in the league in Jack Grealish. But they've not been able to solve their defensive issues. So my prediction is that it'd be Norwich, Villa, and on the last day, I feel West Ham will just get dragged into it.
We actually have Villa in the last game of the season, which I think could be huge.
Oh, that could literally be a 6 point.
I think you're probably right. I think we're in trouble, and we have been poor, and I think we deserve to be where we are. But I think Brighton are going to really struggle. I think they've only had 6 points in 2020. I could be wrong, but I know they were on an awful slump of form, and I believe that they are the team making the most noise to not start the season or to have neutral grounds, and one of them to be Brighton. So I think they are very concerned. They put a lot of faith in Graham Potter, and I think long term that's a great move.
Exactly, I agree.
The money they pumped into that club recently, similarly to Bournemouth, I think will also struggle. I think it's going to be a case of not teams. I think in previous years it's been teams have kept winning, and suddenly they've turned their form around at the end. And I think it's just going to. I think they're going to be a lot of teams continuously losing games, and it'll be whichever team can just claw themselves away from that group.
Interesting, Daniele. What's your take? What's your prediction on the?
Well, first off, it kills me knowing that Norwich could have had 10 more points because I'm a big fan of Pukki as a striker myself. I love the way he works the line, how big of a poacher he is. And then I will say something. I don't know who will relegate, but the forms really don't matter anymore because teams go through basically another break, another preseason, and then they're going to have to start playing again. So whatever happened in 2019, 2020, I think it is not relevant anymore because of the huge break. It's as if teams have gone through another summer break, and then they have to get together. And then there are players who get in shape faster than others, and you have other players who need more games to get that the playing rhythm that they need to perform at their highest. So I cheer for Norwich, even though the situation does not look good now. But I would say Villa, Bournemouth, and maybe I'm gonna follow what Harshal said. Excuse me, and then go for Brighton.
Okay.
That's actually David. I plumped for West Ham, but yeah.
So you think Norwich are going to stay up, Daniela?
I wish. Yes, I developed an affection for them, and if your stats, if there is any justice, then your stats will tell us that Norwich is gonna make a lot of points in the final run of the season.
I don't know what their running looks like, but that'd be interesting. I think what you say about the form is a very valid point. How can you have form when you haven't played for 2 months or whatever? But I think when we look at the Bundesliga, for example, is a bad team, not just a bad team. Werder Bremen looked absolutely horrendous in their first game back. And Frankfurt, who were a little bit of a slump themselves, have again looked atrocious since coming back as well. But then at the same time, Hertha Berlin, who were probably in the worst form of anyone by some distance in the Bundesliga, have really turned it around with a new manager in the break. So, I mean, maybe. But, yeah, what are your thoughts? Do you think do you think it's more a case of a team being in bad form, or do you think it's more of a case of a team just being bad?
I think that coming back, there's gonna be a mix of emotions, motivations. People have gone through maybe even tough times during this suspension. So yeah, I do agree partly that a bad team remains a bad team, but look, the battle right there at the bottom of the table is tight. So it could be that teams that have the most motivations will prevail, regardless of whether on paper they're actually the team with the less quality.
And just to pop in there, Daniel, I actually looked at Norwich's games. They have 9 games left. The run-in doesn't look too kind. They have to play Arsenal, Chelsea, and City. So 3 of their 9 games are against Arsenal, Chelsea, and City. But at the same time, they have 3 matches against teams around them. So there is a game against West Ham, there is a game against Brighton, and there is a match against Watford. So those 3 matches could potentially be the ones that decide whether they stay up. If they manage to take points from all 3 of those games, we could be in for a comeback.
And those are the so-called 6-point matches. So those are going to be key.
Well, one thing I'm certain we will all agree on is they will certainly play to win. They won't play not to lose. And my sense is that many of the other teams are going to play not to lose. And it's a brand new season. So really is, and it'll be fascinating to see what that run is. Well, thank you for that, folks. Why don't we move to the next segment, which is really doing a deeper dive on one of the teams in relegation, Bournemouth, who I think in the beginning of the season, really there was a great deal of promise. There's certainly been a great deal of investment.
Goals. So they first season in the Premier League was 2015-16, and they finished 16th, following season 9th, then 12th and 14th. And they've had a net spend since then of £133.37 million, which for a club that's really got the label of being a small club is a huge amount as a net spend, let alone, I mean, their actual spend is obviously far greater when you think about some of the players that have left. And I worked out that if we're looking at purely just net spend, that's £653,774.51 per point they have made in that time just from net spend. Big signings have been Jefferson Lerma, 25 million, Dominic Solanke, 19 million, Billing from Huddersfield and Jordan Ibe, they're both 15 million each. I'm actually a big fan of Philip Billing, but I haven't been overly impressed with the other 3, to be honest with you, since they've been a part of the club. So I would question some of their recruitment, certainly. I don't know how you feel about that, Harshal.
Yeah, I have absolutely the same thoughts. I remember doing a magazine piece on Bournemouth. I think it was a year ago. Because they were doing really well at that time, and my magazine piece was basically around how they were doing well. So in the 18-19 season, and the drop-off I've seen from them since then to now has been astonishing. And obviously, the injuries they've had in the squad have played a huge role. As you said earlier, they've not had David Brooks. So that's one side of the attack gone. And what people also need to remember is that Ryan Fraser has had an absolutely horrendous season on the other side. He had, I think, 14 assists in the league last season, and he's had barely any. I think he has a couple, or maybe even less than that, of assists this year.
He was widely touted with a move to a bigger club. I'm sure Arsenal were linked with Fraser last
Yeah,
summer.
exactly. He was linked to Arsenal. And he's actually gone out and spoken on record, I think earlier this year, when he said that his head was turned, basically, and he hasn't. That's the reason why he's not performed at his best. And his contract expires at the end of this season, and it doesn't look like Bournemouth are going to sort of renew it. So he is a potential bargain for someone to pick up, but that's obviously after all this after the business of this season is done. And yeah, they've not been good in terms of their tactics and the way they've played. And I think a lot of it was also down to the fact that Eddie Howe does not really experiment too much. He has a set system and a set formation which he uses. He's not really tried to change things around when things haven't been going well. So and as we can see on the slide, recruitment hasn't been their strongest suit either. They've not really recruited well on overall. I mean, they've had a couple of good buys, but overall they've not done well. They've spent big money on players who haven't delivered.
So I'm fascinated that Eddie Howe, who is manager of the year 2015, now has really struggled. I mean, many of him see him as the next great hope for English coaching, and it's a real vexing issue because I think they have talent, but the thing about football is it's a game of probabilities, right? That's why you have to show up and you play the game. And it seems like Bournemouth has gotten the kind of the lower hand draw of cards this season. So it'll be fascinating to see how they continue to go in the next 8 or 9 games. Coach, talk to us a little bit about how Bournemouth performs in the half spaces here.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, they look to build up from the back, to be fair to them. Generally, you'll see them play Nathan Aki and Steve Cook as a centre-back partnership. And Aki's more of a ball player. He'll look to keep the ball quite short when he's playing out, whereas Steve Cook's more direct, and I'll talk about that in a second. They look to have a single or a double pivot drop in, generally in the half-space areas, to try and play past the high press, such as in this image that we've got here. But for me personally, I feel they get pushed into wide areas far too often, which make it a lot easier to press. And this is just an example of playing inside and the press being set up. It's just a trap to allow them to play into that half space and then press the left back as he's the only option here. So they structure a lot of what they do from these, like playing into these areas. If you look at the next slide, Chris, this is from Steve Cook's side. A lot of the time, he's going to look to skip the pivot, and the pivot drops deep to bring the opposition press forward, but also to create a gap between the midfield and the defence. That's the opposition midfield and defence. And you can see Callum Wilson play up front predominantly by himself. And Wilson, don't get me wrong, he's a talented forward, but I personally don't think he's a lone forward. I think he'd be a lot better playing with essentially a target man. I think he would have done excellent at West Ham, but we're not going to spend 50 million on a player like Callum Wilson. So this just shows the sort of thing that Steve Cook will look to do. We'll have Callum Wilson dropping into the half spaces himself, and Cook's going to hit a longer pass, and he's off screen in this image, but a longer pass into him. Then straight away, you're going to look for the wide players rather than number 10 to offer support to Wilson. And that can lead to him being isolated if the wingers aren't high enough. But as you can see in this example, you've got the left winger inverting from his side, and he comes into a more traditional 10/ really number 9 position where you'd expect someone to be. He's going to come in closer, whereas the right winger would go behind. And you see a lot of the time with Bournemouth, with Wilson, what they'll do is, again, look to draw the defence out. That's something that we've seen a lot of their play. So Wilson drops deep, looking to bring the centre-back with him in this case.
David, just if I could quickly jump in there, I think first of all, the comment that West Ham wouldn't spend 50 million on Wilson, but some of the players they've spent on aren't really lighting up the league either, are they? In terms of West Ham, not Bournemouth.
I think that's a bit unfair. I think Allah we spent good money on, but we played him in the wrong system. I think Felipe Anderson was really good last year, but he's struggled this year. But I don't think our style of football suited him particularly either. But I mean, other than those,
Yarmolenko, I think, has been a bit of a flop.
Sure,
although he's been injured as well.
20 million's a lot less to spend than 50.
Yeah, but so that was just because I picked up on that.
Callum Wilson had a huge barren run this season. I can't remember how many minutes it was, but it was an obscene amount of time without even, I think it was having a shot on target, let alone a goal. And And so they've really
that's
struggled to get the ball into decent attacking areas as a team.
and that tells you directly in terms of how much of a drop off Bournemouth have had, because based on his form for Bournemouth, he's got England caps over the last couple of years. But coming back to some of the deeper sort of stuff that you were talking about, I think a lot of it is down to the fact, in terms of how Bournemouth built up and the fact that they've not been that effective, is the fact that they usually play a 4-4-2, right, or a 4-4-1-1, or at most. I mean, although I haven't really seen Eddie Howe do this too much, but I think he's played a 4-2-3-1 a few times. But it's basically a 4-4-2, basically two, where you have those sort of three lines with two banks of four and two attackers up front, right? And that sort of that position, formation lends itself to you having, or the team having to build up down the wings. The natural progression of the ball usually happens down the wings because the midfield is in straight lines. You don't have the sort of players in between the lines, which, for example, if you were playing a 4-2-3-1, you would naturally have a number 10 in the half spaces centrally and in between the lines to pick up the ball. Whereas in a 4-4-2, especially with Josh King and Callum Wilson, both of them are the type of guys. I mean, I don't think either of them really drops into the space. It's more Josh King usually drifts out wide. And that's, again, why they try to progress the ball down the flanks. And that, again, plays into the fact that teams have identified this and they sort of set up pressing traps so that when the ball does go out wide, and it's easier for teams to press when the ball is out wide because you've got the touchline there as well as a natural sort of barrier. So that allows teams to press Bournemouth a lot easier because they know they're only going to, or they're aiming to progress the ball down wide, out wide. I think Eddie Howe could do better than to try and instigate some sort of passing movement or progressive ball movement through the center of the pitch, because I think that's something that they're really lacking.
I just don't think they have. I don't think they have the players for it. And I think they have used the 4-1-4-1 more often, but only slightly. I think Philip Billing, as I mentioned earlier, is a very intelligent player, really good manipulating space. But other than Billing, I don't think there's a huge amount of quality in the spine of that side. I think they're slightly better with the 4-1-4-1 than a 4-4-2, but I don't think it's by much. In fact, I'm sure I have the points per games for those formations somewhere. Let me see.
So Daniele,
4-1-4-1 is 0.8 points per game. 4-4-2 is 1.07 points per game. So actually slightly better than a 4-4-2.
So Daniele, any thoughts on these tactical elements? And you have to actually get on the pitch and put balls in the back of the net. You have a take on this?
Looking at this picture, I really like what Bournemouth are doing, because this is what we call the third man, right? So the deeper guy on the field initiate the action in this case by passing it to the wide guy, and then he just attacks the space higher up the field. The ball doesn't come straight at him. It comes at him after another pass, which is going to involve the player that you guys see right now in between lines as a 10. And that is key to create space and to allow a guy, like the deeper guy, to attack the space without the ball. So when it comes to him, he's going to be in full sprint and in a good position, even though he only basically touched the ball at the beginning, and then all he had to do was run and trust his teammates.
Look, and it's a lot easier. This was against Chelsea, who in this game played a 3-5-2, but in defence that's a 5-4-1 or a 4-5-1, depending. So, I mean, wing backs are a lot more likely to come forward and get pulled out of position, and that's less of an issue. But nevertheless, that was something they're looking to do. And again, we see him focusing on pulling players out of the defence and then trying to hit that space. But yeah, Daniel is absolutely spot on. So, there's several things I could talk about with Bournemouth, but one of the big issues is how they look on defensive transition, which I think has been a big issue for them this season. I mean, it's particularly evident in the Liverpool game. Don't get me wrong, Liverpool are very good at drawing teams and making mistakes and not transitioning as quick as they do. But nevertheless, I think in this game, again, it showed a lack of depth in the side. Jack Simpson was playing at centre-back, who had a woeful time in this game. And in this particular case, he's decided to play the pass to his teammate from this distance whilst under pressure, which is just absolute madness. But what's particularly interesting is that the right back here we can see is starting to creep forward, even though Sadio Mane is standing next to him, leaving Nathan Ake incredibly by himself. Whereas if we look at the Liverpool front three, we've got Firmino, Salah and Mane all in a straight line, close possession and narrow, so that they can counter really, really quickly. And they do this when they counter press. You'll see as soon as the ball is lost, suddenly they get into that shape again, and the midfielder are incredibly effective at winning the ball back quickly. And in this case, the right back came up too far out of position, and Liverpool won the ball back here and countered straight through the centre of the pitch. And this is just an isolated incident, but there are several examples of this happening this season, and some of them have led to goals, some of them haven't. But there seems to be a lack of, I don't know if it's a lack of understanding or whether they're just not well drilled enough in switching from in possession into the defensive transition. And you see things like this happen where both fullbacks are high, and maybe the centre backs could be split, or in this case, the centre backs are split vertically rather than horizontally. And that's a big issue. And I think that you're going to really struggle in a league like the Premier League, where pressing and counter-attacking is becoming so much more prevalent season upon season, if you can't switch into defensive transition quick enough, if you're not smart enough as a team to see that.
Good.
So, another thing, sorry, Christopher, to cut you out. Another thing I've noticed personally about Bournemouth defensively as well is that they concede a lot of goals where the ball is played in behind, and their offside line doesn't really work. And they're trying to catch the opposition offside, but the line isn't being held properly, or someone's either dropped deep or has not pushed up quick enough, and the opposition has gone on and scored. And that, again, to tie into what David says, it maybe points towards there not being, I think that they might not be doing enough defensive work, both in transition and in the proper defensive phase as well. Because, I throw it to Daniel or David. Obviously Daniel plays the game and he would know, and David also is a coach. But I would think that side of the game, the defensive side, and simple stuff like the offside line and all of that would be basics, or rather, you would be expected to have those concepts drilled into you, if not at the beginning of the seasons. They should be second nature as the season goes on, right?
And I will add to the visual that David gave us, especially when you play against high pressing team like Liverpool's, horizontal passes, also called square passes, they are the worst because they're very dangerous and they're the easiest to intercept. And you know what happens when a team like Liverpool intercepts that kind of pass with the fast players they have in front, then you're in real danger.
Yeah, 100%. I think with the point Harshal makes, that's a fair point. It's not something that I'd actually seen, but that's interesting. I'll have to have a look at that. As a guess, I would say that they've had a huge amount of personnel changes in their back four, which doesn't help. And I think that they play the high line to try and support Wilson, particularly when he's playing by himself. You don't want to play a deep line when you're playing with a lone forward. That's quite difficult for that forward, particularly if you're looking to counter effectively. And Bournemouth aren't as good. When you look at teams like Liverpool, for example, Bournemouth aren't going to outplay a Liverpool. So it comes down to moments in the game, and one of the easiest ways for a team like that to get a result is to force errors, which is easier said than done, but that might suggest why they play with a higher line in those games.
Interesting. Well, good. Well, one thing I wanted to bring up with you, David, Daniele, Harshal, and I spoke before the recording, as well as other folks in the community, and we're wondering, you've made some great choices. You married a great woman, Maddie, from a reputable family, but you're still making poor life choices on choosing to cheer for West Ham. So we are actively intervening right now to try to figure out how do we shake this bad habit of yours? Because it's very self-destructive, I think.
My nan grew up on Green Street, funnily enough. So she used to go to games when she was a kid, and then that was just passed on to my dad, and that was passed on to me. So you don't choose West Ham. You're
born into it. Yeah.
But it's been a difficult experience, I think, in recent years with moving to the stadium. I thought I'm sure a lot of West Ham fans would agree with me. I think we were sold a bit of a dream there, and as a season ticket holder, I can tell you that the match day experience is not worth what we pay. And actually, I won't be renewing next season. I've already made that decision.
Wow. Interesting. Well, what we'd like to do is go ahead and switch to the next segment, which is really having a conversation about the pre-COVID team of the year. As Daniele pointed out, because of this break, it's really kind of two seasons we're going to be starting, or a second season starting hopefully in mid to late June. Harshal, can you walk us through I guess what we're going to do is we're going to put a poll up on Twitter, and we're going to figure out what the people's choice is. And next time around, we're going to discuss who the winners are. But can we spend a few minutes and talk about the candidates? Can you walk us through that?
Yep. So I'm going to start at the back, and I think obviously, Chris, with you having obviously you've played the game as a keeper, so we're going to start off there and try to at first try and figure out who were the best keepers in the league, obviously pre-COVID. So the candidates are Dean Henderson from Sheffield United, Alisson from Liverpool, Nick Pope at Burnley, Kasper Schmeichel at Leicester City, Bernd Leno at Arsenal, and Ben Foster from Watford. So if I just want to start that discussion, in my opinion, I'd say it would be Dean Henderson for me. And while there is a bit of, I'd say, favoritism there, because he is obviously a Manchester United player on loan at Sheffield United, and I want him to do well because then there's a chance of him coming back and taking the spot at Old Trafford. But even if I look at it just from an objective point of view, Henderson has been extremely impressive. He has he's been a big part of why Sheffield United are where they are in the table, and they're challenging for Europe. So their defense has been a big part of that, and within that defensive unit, obviously Henderson has done really well. He's made some fantastic saves throughout the season, and another thing that's really shown through is his mentality, because I think whoever has been following the league will remember that he made a pretty big error in the game against Liverpool at Bramall Lane at their stadium early on in the season, which was the only goal of the game. They were 0-0 at the time, and he made an error, and I think it was Firmino who scored. And that could have easily led to a sort of crisis in confidence and him sort of spiraling and not being able to keep up his performances. But in that very same game, he pulled off a brilliant save, I think, a few minutes later, and his performance levels have actually only gotten better since then. So that just shows that he has the mentality and he has the sort of mental strength to be able to cope with playing in the Premier League. And I'll go as far as to say that, in my opinion, he should be England's number one sooner rather than later. I don't think Jordan Pickford is good enough in terms of his pure goalkeeping ability to be the number one keeper for England. So in my opinion, it should be Dean Henderson, who should be the goalkeeper of the year in the Premier League. What do you guys think?
Well, I'll offer two other vantage points quickly, because I know we have a lot of positions to cover. But, it's hard to vote against an Alisson. He clearly hasn't had the save opportunities. But what's freaky about him is it seems like he always takes the ball in the chest, and that's because his positioning and his ability to see things 0.2 of a second faster is better than most. And sometimes when you have such an outstanding defense and you don't have many opportunities to make a save, one can get rusty. And I really haven't seen much let up at all from him. One or two exceptions. So that's one case. It's hard to vote against a keeper where they're 25 points ahead, right? And their defensive numbers are stellar, and we'll get into the specifics next week. The other I'd probably advocate is for Kasper Schmeichel. He has had to kind of transition a fairly youngish defense, and I think the metrics are going to bear really well with his performances next week. But there's also just that what coaches just call swagger, where you just know that he's going to make that big save when he needs to. And I know that's not quantifiable per se, but most of the coaches I know that don't know a whole lot about goalkeeping end up going with that, rightly or wrongly. But I think he might be the best combination. Quite honestly, I'm not sure Leicester is in the top four without his performances. So those are my thoughts on keeping. But
they've greatly outperformed their expected goals against.
Yeah,
Chris as well, and they've had an expected goals against of 36.5 and conceded just 28.
I think next week when we get into the numbers, we'll see that Schmeichel is really in the top of the rankings in many of the goalkeeping metrics. But let's carry on to defenders. What's your read on the defenders?
So obviously Liverpool stands out straight away. So Virgil van Dijk, Joe Gomez are two of the standout options. But then you've also got the Leicester pair, who we think have done really well, which is obviously Chagla Soyuncu and Johnny Evans, and then a sole Man United representative in Harry Maguire. So from just looking at the centre backs, I feel it should be the Liverpool pair hands down. Van Dijk and Joe Gomez have, even though I think Gomez hasn't really played throughout the season. It was Joel Matip who was playing at the start, and then he got injured, and they had Lovren playing for a bit as well, because Gomez himself, I think, was recovering from an injury. But since he's come back, he's formed a really good partnership with Van Dijk, and the numbers speak for themselves. Liverpool's defensive numbers have been astonishing this year. And
so you're telling me player for player, you think Joe Gomez is better than Charles Soyuncu?
Maybe not player for player.
Go on.
Sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Well, listen, I don't think Soyuncu's like a well beater. He makes mistakes, but I think if you ask me who was the better individual player, not part of the better unit, then you surely have to go with Soyuncu, not Gomez.
So that's what I am probably looking at this from the point of view in terms of what the entire team would look like, and in terms of what they would, how they would play as a unit. But you're obviously in terms of what you're saying, you're basically going to pick the best 11 players, right? So in that sense, yeah, probably Soyuncu. But honestly, in my opinion, I think Johnny Evans has been a better defender for Leicester this season than Soyuncu. He's very underrated, and people have been talking a lot more about Soyuncu. But I think Evans has been the guy who's been leading the defense in terms of, he's just a lot, he's extremely calm. And I'm not saying that Soyuncu isn't. Soyuncu is a brilliant player, and he has a lot of potential, given that this was his I think this is his debut season, right? So he does have a lot of potential, but I think Evans, as the experienced head next to him,
all I'm trying to say is United themed team here.
I think you were going to say that. I knew you were going to say that, but no, that's not the aim of this. Although, to be fair, this is basically what United are going to pick up, right? Somehow try and get somebody into the team of the season. We're not winning anything else, so I'll take what I can get. But
so Daniele, as a striker, who would you enjoy least going up against of those defenders?
Besides Van Dijk, obviously, which a player that has to be there. I think that I will go with David, and I'm gonna go with Soyuncu because this guy is very aggressive, and at the same time he's young. So as soon as he learns when to step out and when to wait, he can become really a complete defender. Not that he's not complete now, but he has room for improvement. So as soon as he steps up his mental game, I would say, his awareness, then it will be a tough guy to go against.
Beautiful. Well, good. Well, so let's switch to midfielders now. Harshal, what do you got for us?
There's quite a huge selection of players because 3 roles in midfield, but I'll just pick out some of the standout candidates that we have. So first up, obviously, Kevin De Bruyne leading the league in assists, could break Thierry Henry's all-time season record of 20 assists this year. He's on 16, so pretty much in his grasp to be able to get past Henry's record. You have Fabinho, who before his injury was showing how crucial he is to locking down the defensive side of things for Liverpool. Wilfred Ndidi, a similar sort of player for Leicester, who they've missed hugely when he's been during the time when he was injured. I mean, I don't have the stats on hand right now, but the difference in points per game when he has played as opposed to when he hasn't played is massive for Leicester. And again, if you look at some of the more attacking midfielders, you have Mateo Kovacic, who has done, who's shown that he can be the box-to-box sort of guy who drives with the ball forward for Chelsea, and two really good young English playmakers in Jack Grealish and James Maddison, who, I mean, I don't know if they'll play for England because England don't really play with a playmaker or a number 10, but they're certainly putting the case forward to be in the discussion for England, especially with the Euros being postponed and we're having them next year. So they have another season to be, try and get into there. But standout midfielder of the year by far has to be Kevin De Bruyne. He's had, even though City have dropped down a level from where they were last year, he hasn't. He's been one of the most, as he has been in his time in the Premier League, been one of the most creative and most dangerous midfielders in the league. What do you guys think? Any other players or who else do you think has been good from that point?
Well, I mean, I think obviously, completely agree with what you said about De Bruyne. I think Grealish has, had a real breakout season, and I think he deserves potentially to be in this team. I think he's had the 5th most progressive runs per 90 minutes in the league, which is outstanding, and particularly when you look at the team that he's been playing in this season. I think Oliver Norwood deserves a mention. I think he's been outstanding in central midfield for Sheffield United. I saw a graphic recently on Twitter, and I can't remember who it was, so I apologise, but I can't remember who did it. I want to say one of the Liverpool guys, Distance Covered, I think might have done it, and it showed which player is most likely to switch the ball in the league when they have possession, and it's Oliver Norwood by a mile. And he's just very good at circulating the ball, keeping things ticking. As soon as a team, like, for example, Sheffield United overload one side of the pitch and they're looking to quickly exploit space on the other side, he's just a phenomenal option to do that quickly. I think that a lot of what he does won't show up statistically, but I think he's been excellent. Daniela, anyone that you've seen this season that you've been particularly impressed with in central midfield?
Well, I'm a fan of Jorginho, of his short passes, of the fact that he's always positioned right with his body, always sideways, never facing his own goal, so that he doesn't know what's going on behind him. His awareness is just incredible. And as a guy who has to put pressure, as a guy myself who has to put pressure on the central defensive midfielder, those that know when you're coming are the worst to press, because they know when to release, when to take a touch around you. And then for the remaining two, I'm going to go with Kevin De Bruyne, and I'm going to go with Wijnaldum. It's his runs are just killer. The way he times his runs in the box, and his others too make a difference.
So who we put? So we've got De Bruyne for sure as a lock-in, right? And I'd probably be willing to go with Kovacic as well. So it's that final spot. I'm going to say Norwood, but if you guys want to go with Jorginho, I'll take that.
My contention, David. My contention with Norwood is that is it the system that's making him that good, or is he a good player by himself? In the sense that I think Sheffield United are just so incredibly well drilled, and everybody knows their roles so well. Which is obviously, I'm not saying that that makes Norwood a bad player. All I'm saying is that he's being elevated, or he's maybe the best of his game has come out because of the team he's playing in, and he may not be able to do it in another team.
You could argue that about any player, really. It's around the links with what they have, but I think Norwood's been outstanding, and he's got a very important role in that team. I think he has the 3rd most passes into the final third in the league in total, behind Jorginho and Alexander-Arnold, which is not bad company. So I think he's incredibly underrated, and I would say that actually, if anything, the fact that he's doing it in a Sheffield United team where I think the sum of their parts is greater, certainly than they are by themselves. And I think if you put him in a team, possibly, and this is no diss to the Sheffield United players, but you put him in a team where he was surrounded by better players, I think that you would see an even greater increase in what he can do.
Well, good. Well, let's go ahead and switch our attention to the strikers or the forwards.
Yeah, we've got a whole host of options here. So Jamie Vardy leads the scoring charts at the moment. Could potentially pick up the Golden Boot this year. Aubameyang, Aguero, Danny Ings has had quite a, I wouldn't say a breakout season because he's been around for a while, but it's certainly been his best season by far in front of goal. And if you were to look at some of the wider attackers who've done well, Sadio Mane has been outstanding for Liverpool. Raheem Sterling, although he's not hit the heights that he has previously for City, but he's again been a consistent sort of goal scorer and he's provided assists as well. On the opposite side, you've got Salah and Riyad Mahrez who've done well. Rashford was doing well before he got injured. Heung-min Son similarly was doing really well before he picked up an injury as well. So there's a lot of players to pick from here. And for me, if you were asking me what my ideal front three from this list would be, it'd probably be Mane, Vardy, and Salah. Like, probably that's who I would go for. What about you guys?
David, what's your take?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. I think that you're absolutely right. There are a bunch of players that could be. I mean, so I think Vardy for me goes in straight away. 24 goals and assists combined, which is the most in the league. So I feel like you have to put him in. And I'll keep it short and sweet. I think Sadio Mane is possibly in the conversation of top 5, possibly even top 3 players in the world right now. I think he's just a phenomenal individual talent. And I think that regardless of what's going on in the world right now and financially, I still think there are going to be a lot of people, a lot of big clubs looking mainly at Barca and Real Madrid who would like to bring someone like him in.
Daniele.
I'm going to have to go with Mahrez because the way he cuts on the right wing is just fabulous for me. And then I would like also to mention Danny Ings. I studied a lot of number 9s and he is amazing in the box. His movements, the way he tests the line, and he's always in the right spot at the right moment.
I think Ings has had a great season. I'm going to be honest and say I don't think he'll be this good again next season. I think he's a 12-goal, 13-goal sort of striker, and I think he's on 15 this season already. Yeah. And I know for a fact that he's vastly outperformed his expected goals, which always concerns me slightly. If I see that, I'd much prefer to see a player scoring their exact expected goals. That's where I would sort of go, okay, I'm happy with that. You don't expect that performance to fluctuate necessarily. But yeah, I think he's had a great season. I think if the Euros had been on this summer, I think he would have gone.
Yeah, I think he's missed his chance with England.
Yeah, I don't. If I'm going to be bold, and I don't think he'll be in the squad for next summer.
Yeah.
But for Daniele's sake, I hope I'm wrong.
So
yeah, we'll see.
as a current keeper, but more, I think my mindset is I know 75% of the goals are scored between the 6 and the 18. And if you look at the posts and you go out diagonally, and the people that I would fear the absolute most in that so-called kill zone is Aguero, and Salah and Mane. They have such a presence of mind in my mind, and if that's where 75% of the goals are scored, those are the sort of strikers I'm going to fear the most. And I would say Aguero is maybe even a little half notch above the other two, just because he can score so many different ways, whether it's on the 3-yard line on a hard low cross, or from the 12 or 14 yards out. So those would be my 3 picks. But we're going to let the people decide and have this discussion next week. So I think that was a wonderful primer on things. And
Chris, should we point out that we're doing it as a 4-3-3, or did you already say
that? Yes, it is as a 4-3-3. Thank you for reminding folks that, and we'll probably put that out on the in the Twitterverse as well. So Our podcast is generously supported by the Accelerator School, a North Carolina soccer-focused middle and high school with locations in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Malaga, Spain. Please visit them at www.accelerator.school. We'd like to also thank Total Football Analysis. They are the world's largest open source soccer analyst community. Please visit www.totalfootballanalysis.com and join and support the revolution. So join us on our next Football Thinking Fans podcast. Free at last, free at last. For now, bella ciao, ciao, ciao.